Welcome, listeners. You are about to immerse yourselves in a gripping mystery, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourselves for a journey through the shadowed halls of history, where secrets long buried are about to be revealed. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Secrets Beneath the Tower of London. The Tower of London loomed against the dull grey sky, an ancient silhouette of stone and history. The air carried the biting chill of early autumn, yet it was the oppressive weight of something hidden in the shadows that made the atmosphere heavier than usual. Sherlock Holmes, his keen eyes never resting, surveyed the scene before him, his footsteps echoing in the courtyard, blending with the murmur of the gathered workers. A sense of quiet dread hung in the air, as though the very stones beneath them were whispering secrets from another time. "It is as if the ground itself has been disturbed," Dr. Watson remarked, adjusting his coat against the cold. His breath clouded in the air, his words lost briefly before being swallowed up by the wind. "I've never seen the tower's grounds so desolate." Holmes did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the entrance to the newly unearthed chamber, the arched door now barely ajar. The archaeologists had already begun to pour in, their voices eager but strained, discussing their discovery with a nervous excitement that only those unfamiliar with the darkness of history could possess. "We must tread carefully," Holmes said, his voice calm but sharp, as it always was when dealing with matters that called for intellect rather than instinct. "Every stone in this place tells a story, some stories better left buried." Watson, ever the optimist, followed closely behind as they made their way into the ancient chamber. The interior was dim, lit only by the flickering lamps the archaeologists had carried down with them. The walls, damp with age, seemed to breathe in the stillness, while the faint smell of earth and stone pervaded the air. But it wasn't the scent of the chamber that caught Holmes's attention. It was the thing lying at its centre. A body, or rather, the remains of one, sprawled awkwardly across the cold floor. The body was that of a man, dressed in what appeared to be a faded, tattered coat, an anachronism in itself. His hands were bound behind him, his legs splayed unnaturally, and the features of his face were obscured by a mask of dust and grime. His eyes, wide open, stared unblinking at the stone ceiling above. Holmes stepped forward, his boots silent against the damp stone, and crouched beside the body. His fingers moved with surgical precision, lifting the remnants of the man's clothing to examine them. A peculiar symbol, almost invisible under layers of dirt, was etched into the fabric, a pattern Holmes instantly recognized, though its meaning eluded him for the moment. "Odd," Holmes muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This man has been here far longer than the circumstances of his death suggest." Watson knelt beside him, his expression unreadable. "You think he's been here for centuries?" Holmes looked up from his examination of the man's coat, meeting Watson's gaze with a mixture of intrigue and resolve. "At least that long. The stonework here. It's older than most records suggest. This man was sealed in this place for a purpose." A nearby archaeologist, an older man with thinning grey hair and a perpetual frown, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "we've found something else. Something that may interest you." Holmes stood swiftly, his eyes flicking to the archaeologist as he gestured toward a nearby table. On it was a small chest, intricately carved and encrusted with dust, its metal hinges old but still functioning. The chest had been untouched for centuries, perhaps longer, but the presence of the body suggested that it was far from just a simple artifact. Holmes moved toward the chest, his sharp eyes studying the intricate carvings on its surface. His fingers traced the lines of the design, a motif of entwined serpents, their heads facing opposite directions. He turned to the archaeologist. "Has anyone opened it?" The archaeologist hesitated, wiping his brow nervously. We thought it best to wait for you, sir." Holmes nodded, a flicker of approval passing through his eyes. With a small twist of his wrist, he pried open the chest, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled in velvet, was an ancient letter, its edges yellowed with age, and its writing nearly faded beyond recognition. Holmes's brow furrowed as he reached for it. The letter, though delicate, seemed to hum with a quiet intensity, as if it held secrets that had been waiting for someone to uncover them. As Holmes carefully unrolled the paper, his eyes scanned the faded ink. The words, while partially illegible, hinted at something far darker than a mere historical curiosity. "There is more to this than simple archaeology," Holmes murmured, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into his coat. "This man's death, these symbols, this chest, it's all part of something much greater." Watson glanced between Holmes and the body, his brow furrowing. "You mean to say this is no mere relic, but part of a far-reaching conspiracy?" Holmes rose from his crouch, his expression unreadable but his mind already racing. "A conspiracy, yes, and perhaps in time, something more dangerous." Before Watson could respond, another figure stepped forward from the shadows, his presence unnoticed until now. A young man, one of the dig workers, his face pale with fear, held a piece of parchment tightly in his hand. He seemed to hesitate before approaching Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," the young man said in a low, strained voice, "there's something you should see." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his attention now fully on the worker. "What is it?" The worker handed over the parchment, his fingers trembling. Holmes unfurled it slowly. The paper was covered in strange symbols that matched those on the man's clothing, the very same markings etched into the walls of the chamber. The worker's eyes were wide with anxiety. "I found this," he whispered, "on the other side of the chamber. It wasn't there before." Holmes's fingers tightened around the parchment, his eyes gleaming with sharp interest. "This is no accident. Someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that these secrets remain hidden. And now, they want them buried again." He turned back to the body on the floor, his mind spinning with the implications. This was only the beginning. The secrets beneath the tower were waiting to be uncovered. But would he be able to unravel them before those who sought to keep them hidden turned against him? The air outside the tower was sharp with the scent of wet stone, the day's fog pressing in thick like a veil over the city. Holmes stood, his figure silhouetted against the ancient structure, staring at the distant horizon, as though contemplating the mysteries buried there. Dr. Watson lingered a few paces behind, his breath clouding in the crisp morning air. The case had grown heavier by the minute, and already Holmes's mind was racing with half-formed thoughts and the weight of questions that refused to be answered. "I trust you've made your observations, Watson?" Holmes's voice broke the silence, sharp as always but carrying an undercurrent of something that was almost like anticipation. Watson adjusted his hat and sighed, his gaze shifting from the tower to Holmes's ever-watchful eyes. "I've seen enough to know that something far darker is at play here than a mere archaeological discovery. The body, the symbols, and now that letter. It's all pointing to something, but I'm not yet certain what." Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, one that suggested both amusement and the glint of a deeper understanding. "You have no need to be certain, Watson. That is my role. But I agree with you. The pieces of this puzzle are fitfully beginning to take shape." They turned away from the tower, making their way toward the bustling tent where the archaeologists and officials were gathered. The noise of their conversation was a hum of excited chatter, though it seemed far too light-hearted for the gravity of the situation. As Holmes entered, the voices faltered into silence, the eyes of the room turning toward him. The figure of Dr. Albert Harrington, a man in his early 50s with a sharp nose and a look of perpetual concern, stood near the centre of the room. His gaze met Holmes's immediately, but there was an odd hesitancy in his step as he approached. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice crisp and rehearsed. "I trust you found everything to your liking in the chamber?" Holmes studied him intently, noting the small twitch of Harrington's hand as it gripped the edge of a nearby table. "I would say it is not a matter of liking, Dr. Harrington, but rather necessity. We are in need of clarity, not comfort." The archaeologist's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course, I fully understand. I merely meant—" He stopped mid-sentence, as though catching himself. "Perhaps we could discuss the findings in greater detail?" Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "I believe that would be prudent." They sat at a nearby table, the others in the room slowly resuming their murmured conversations, but never straying too far from the pair. The tension in the air was palpable, even more so now that the discovery had been made public. But there was something about Harrington's demeanour, something tight about his posture, that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "What can you tell me about the history of the chamber?" Holmes asked, his voice measured but carrying the weight of his intent. "The body, as you are aware, is not a recent addition to this place. I suspect it has lain in that very position for centuries." Harrington stiffened, his eyes flickering toward the gathered officials before returning to Holmes. "The tower, as you know, has a history that stretches back to the very founding of this city. But this chamber, this discovery, it is unusual, even by the tower's standards. The records we have are incomplete, and some, I fear, have been lost to time." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Lost, you say? Or hidden?" Harrington swallowed visibly, the flicker of unease that crossed his features almost imperceptible. "It is possible, Mr. Holmes, that we are dealing with something much older than we anticipated. It could be a relic of an earlier time, one far more secretive." "A secretive time," Holmes repeated, the words slow and deliberate. "Perhaps a secret society?" Dr. Harrington's breath caught. For a moment his eyes flickered with something unreadable, fear perhaps. He recovered quickly, straightening in his chair. "A society, yes. There are rumours, of course, of secret orders and their influence on the tower's past. But I would advise caution, Mr. Holmes. This could all be far less sinister than you believe." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted toward Lady Violet Fairfax, who stood near the far side of the room. She was a striking figure, tall and poised, her aristocratic bearing unmistakable even in the midst of such unremarkable surroundings. Her sharp eyes met Holmes's gaze as he turned, and she smiled, just slightly, but enough to send a ripple of unease through him. Watson, who had been observing the scene silently, leaned closer. "What do you make of her, Holmes? She's connected to the tower, I understand." Holmes's gaze never left Lady Fairfax, who now approached them with a measured, almost deliberate grace. "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice low. "Her family has long had ties to this place, but there is more to Lady Fairfax than her title suggests. She knows something about this discovery, and I intend to find out what." Lady Fairfax's eyes flickered to Watson, then back to Holmes, her smile widening slightly as she arrived at their table. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said smoothly, her voice like silk. "I trust the investigation is proceeding well." Holmes remained silent for a beat, measuring his words before speaking. "It is indeed, Lady Fairfax, but I fear we have barely scratched the surface." "I would agree," she said, her voice edged with a cool sophistication. "Such mysteries always seem to deepen as you dig. But I would caution you, Mr. Holmes. Some things are better left undiscovered." Holmes's eyes narrowed imperceptibly as he studied her, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact for just a moment too long. "I trust you are not suggesting that certain truths are not worth uncovering?" Lady Fairfax's smile faltered only briefly, but it was enough to tell Holmes that she was not entirely at ease. "Not at all. I merely wish for a swift resolution. It would be a shame if such an elegant part of our history were to become overshadowed by less elegant concerns." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on her, feeling the weight of her unspoken words hanging in the air between them. There was something else in her demeanour, something guarded, even wary. She knew more than she was willing to admit. As Lady Fairfax excused herself, Holmes stood, turning toward Watson. She is hiding something. But what exactly? I don't know, Watson said, frowning. But I can't shake the feeling that she's as much a part of this as anyone else. Holmes nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The clues were beginning to fall into place, but there was still so much more to uncover. And as he scanned the room, his gaze landed on Tom Reynolds, the young worker who had discovered the cryptic letter earlier. There was something about his nervous demeanour, his reluctance to meet Holmes's eyes, that suggested the worker knew more than he had let on. The investigation was only beginning. And yet, with every passing moment, Holmes felt the shadow of something darker lurking just beneath the surface. The mist hung heavier that evening, clinging to the streets of London as though it too wished to conceal something. Holmes and Watson stood at the edge of the tower's grounds, their breath rising in fog-like clouds, the hum of the city a distant murmur behind them. The weight of the day had pressed down upon Holmes with an intensity that was not usual for him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strands of this case that seemed to slip away, no matter how tightly he tried to hold them. Holmes took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the tower's silhouette against the dimming sky. His fingers brushed the letter he had found earlier, still tucked safely in his coat. The symbols, though faint, were now more familiar to him, their meaning beginning to settle in his mind. Watson, ever the perceptive companion, watched him closely. "You're thinking of the symbols again, aren't you?" Holmes did not turn to meet his gaze, but there was a slight shift in his posture that betrayed his thoughts. "The symbols are part of something larger, Watson. They are not mere relics of some forgotten society. They are a map, a key to understanding what has been hidden beneath the tower for centuries." Watson frowned. "But what could be hidden? The tower has been thoroughly documented. There shouldn't be any great mysteries left to uncover." Holmes's lips curled into a half-smile, though it held no trace of warmth. "That is exactly what those behind this want us to believe. But the truth, Watson, is often the thing that is most carefully buried." The two of them fell into a contemplative silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of their footsteps. They were on their way to meet with the archaeologist, Dr. Harrington, who had promised to reveal more about the chamber's origins. However, as they neared the gates, Holmes's mind drifted to Lady Fairfax's words. There was an unsettling quality to her calm, controlled demeanour, an air of something unspoken, something veiled beneath the surface. She had dismissed Holmes's inquiries with practiced ease, but Holmes had never been one to overlook such subtleties. "They say that the truth is often hidden in plain sight," Holmes murmured, his gaze distant as he approached the entrance. "You think Lady Fairfax is hiding something?" Watson asked, his voice low. Holmes glanced at his companion, his eyes sharp with clarity. "I know she is. There is a tension in her, a fear that something ancient, is about to be revealed." As they stepped inside the small tent that had been set up as a temporary office for the archaeological team, Dr. Harrington was waiting for them, his face pinched with the strain of the past few days. He greeted them with a strained smile, his eyes flickering nervously. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice not quite steady. "I've managed to gather a few more records that may help you understand the significance of what we've uncovered." Holmes nodded curtly, his gaze scanning the man's every movement. "Lead the way." Harrington gestured to a table stacked with yellowed documents, old maps, and handwritten notes. He moved towards it with the careful air of someone who feared his every action might be under scrutiny. Holmes wasted no time in examining the papers, his fingers moving with precision over the brittle edges of the maps. "There are references here," Holmes said, his voice thoughtful as he scanned the records. "References to the secret society that once held sway over the tower." "The Guardians of the Tower," Watson interjected, his voice laced with curiosity. "The legends spoke of them, but I never took them seriously." Holmes turned to him, his brow furrowing. "You are mistaken, Watson. Legends are often the only records we have of certain truths. These guardians were no mere myth. They were a faction with great power, and they left their mark on the tower's history in ways we are only beginning to understand. Dr. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. I've told you what I know, but some things, some records, have been lost. I'm afraid the tower's history is not as clear-cut as many would like to believe. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied Harrington, noting the man's nervous energy. And you, Dr. Harrington, are quite familiar with those lost records, are you not? Harrington's face paled. I only know what I've been told, but some parts of this history are deliberately hidden. Holmes finished for him, his tone sharp. He turned to Watson, his mind already processing the fragments of information. It is becoming clear, Watson. Someone is attempting to obscure the truth, to keep us from uncovering the full extent of what lies beneath. A tense silence filled the room. Harrington, his hands trembling slightly, seemed to shrink into himself. I'm not involved in this, Mr. Holmes. I only came here to uncover the past, not to bury it. Holmes studied him for a long moment, his eyes unwavering. I believe you, Dr. Harrington, he said at last, but your knowledge is still incomplete. Someone much closer than we realize, is working to prevent us from finding the answers. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Watson's gaze shifted uneasily as he glanced around the room. Something felt off, like a fog was closing in on them, obscuring the very truth they were desperately trying to uncover. Holmes's mind, as sharp and calculating as ever, was piecing together the puzzle, but the pieces kept slipping away from his grasp. As the evening wore on, Holmes and Watson continued to pore over the ancient records, but they were no closer to understanding the true significance of the body found beneath the tower. The more they learned, the more questions arose. There were mentions of a betrayal, an ancient ritual, and a symbol that appeared in multiple locations, both on the body and in the records, but none of it seemed to fit together. At the end of the evening, as they prepared to leave, Holmes stopped at the door of the tent, his mind still racing. There was something here, something elusive, and it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He couldn't afford to let it get away. Tomorrow, Watson, Holmes said quietly, turning to face his friend. Tomorrow we'll find the next piece of this puzzle. The truth is out there, and we will uncover it, no matter how long it takes. But as they stepped out into the cold night air, a nagging doubt lingered at the back of Holmes's mind. What if the truth wasn't something they were meant to uncover? The morning had broken with an eerie calm, the kind that seemed to cling to London's grey skies. Holmes stood at the window of their modest lodgings, gazing out at the mist that curled in tendrils between the old buildings. The city was stirring, but there was something still, something that weighed heavily on the day. He could not shake the feeling that something was about to surface, something that would illuminate the tangled web of secrets surrounding the tower. Dr. Watson, ever the steady companion, entered the room with a steaming cup of tea, offering it to Holmes with a half smile. I trust the morning finds you in a contemplative mood, Holmes? Or is there some pressing matter? Holmes took the tea without a word, his gaze still distant. I believe we are on the brink of uncovering something significant, Watson. We have moved past conjecture and false leads. It is time for the truth. Watson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You've made some progress, then? Holmes nodded slowly, setting the cup aside. Indeed. I have been going over the records we gathered from Dr. Harrington's tent. There is something in them, something that was staring us in the face all along. His eyes met Watson's, the gleam of determination unmistakable in his gaze. The two men moved quickly through the winding streets of London, their footsteps quickening as they neared the tower. The morning fog clung to their coats, making every shadow seem deeper, every corner darker. Holmes's mind raced with possibilities, each more alarming than the last. It was a sensation that was both exhilarating and unsettling, one that had always accompanied him when the pieces of a case began to fall into place. When they arrived, the atmosphere inside the tower grounds was notably quieter than the day before. The usual bustle of activity had slowed, as though the workers too felt the weight of the unfolding mystery. As they walked toward the site of the chamber, Holmes's sharp eyes took in every detail. The angles of the walls, the way the light shifted over the stone, the faint traces of dust that hinted at something concealed beneath the surface. It was then that Holmes noticed something that had escaped him earlier. A slight indentation in the wall, one that appeared to be part of the same symbol they had seen in the records, an emblem of entwined serpents. The marking was faint, but unmistakable, its edges worn smooth with time. He knelt to examine it, his fingers lightly tracing the stone, feeling for any irregularities beneath the surface. "Watson," he said, his voice calm but urgent, "I believe we have found it." Watson stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. Found what exactly? Holmes's eyes were focused, his mind already piecing together the significance of the symbol. The symbol was not just a marker, Watson. It was a clue, a key to another chamber, one that has remained hidden for centuries. And this indentation, I believe it is part of a mechanism, one that will lead us to what has been concealed. Without waiting for a response, Holmes's fingers moved with precision, pressing gently against the indentation. There was a soft click, followed by a faint grinding sound. The stone wall before them seemed to shift, a hidden door slowly creaking open to reveal a narrow passageway beyond. A rush of cold air spilled into the room, carrying with it the smell of must and age. Holmes's heart quickened, but he maintained his composure, the thrill of discovery sharpening his senses. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The mystery was no longer something to be solved with guesswork. It was something tangible, something real. "Shall we?" Holmes asked, his tone a mixture of resolve and quiet excitement. Watson hesitated for only a moment before nodding, his own curiosity getting the better of him. "After you." The two of them stepped into the passage, the narrow corridor illuminated by the faint glow of torches set in sconces along the walls. The air was thick with dust, the walls covered in age-old inscriptions that seemed to pulse with a forgotten history. As they moved deeper into the passage, the walls seemed to close in around them, as though the very stone was trying to hold on to its secrets. Holmes stopped at a large stone door, its surface carved with the same serpentine symbols that had appeared on the body and the chest. He studied the door for a long moment, his fingers tracing the lines of the carvings. "This is it," he murmured. "Behind this door lies the truth." He pressed his hand against the stone, feeling for any subtle shift. At first, there was nothing. But then, as if by some unseen force, the door creaked open, revealing a small chamber bathed in shadow. The moment they stepped inside, Holmes's sharp eyes immediately fell upon a chest sitting in the centre of the room. It was an old, weathered thing, its surface covered in dust, but its metal hinges gleamed faintly, untouched by time. This chest was not like the others they had found. It was far older, its craftsmanship ancient and far more intricate. Holmes approached the chest with deliberate steps, every movement measured and precise. The air in the room felt heavier now, as though they had crossed a threshold into something far greater than a mere archaeological find. He knelt before the chest, his fingers working expertly to release its clasp. Inside, nestled carefully within layers of velvet, was a scroll. It was unlike any document Holmes had ever seen, its edges scorched, its paper brittle but preserved, as though it had been protected for centuries. Watson leaned over, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the delicate script. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took the scroll, his fingers carefully unrolling it. As the paper unfurled, the language on it became clearer, a series of cryptic symbols, interwoven with an ancient dialect. But it wasn't just the language that captured Holmes's attention. It was the presence of a familiar name, a name that sent a chill through him. The name was that of Lady Violet Fairfax. Holmes's breath caught, his mind racing to process the implications. This discovery was far more than he had anticipated. Lady Fairfax was not just a bystander to this history. She was intricately tied to it, possibly at its very core. A faint noise from behind them caused both Holmes and Watson to turn sharply. The door to the chamber had creaked shut, and standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the corridor, was Lady Fairfax herself. Holmes stood slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of determination and quiet triumph. "It seems, Lady Fairfax," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of revelation, "that we have reached the heart of this mystery." Lady Fairfax stood at the threshold of the chamber, her presence casting an unsettling shadow over the dimly lit room. The door creaked shut behind her with an ominous finality, sealing them within the confines of the ancient stone walls. Holmes's eyes never left her, the weight of the discovery now hanging in the air like a silent accusation. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic crackling of the torches that illuminated the small chamber. Holmes could feel the tension building, the walls pressing in closer as though they, too, sensed the approaching confrontation. Watson, standing beside him, seemed to bristle with anticipation, his hand subtly shifting toward his coat, where his revolver rested. Holmes's gaze remained steady, his mind racing with the implications of the discovery. The scroll, with its cryptic language and the name of Lady Fairfax, was more than a mere coincidence. It was a revelation. But now, with Fairfax standing before them, the revelation was shifting from historical intrigue to something much more dangerous. Lady Fairfax, her expression unreadable, took a single step forward. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, too smooth, as though carefully constructed. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone almost mocking, "you have uncovered the truth, but I fear you have uncovered something that was never meant to be found." Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, though his eyes remained cold. "It appears, Lady Fairfax, that you have been hiding far more than a simple family secret." Fairfax's eyes flickered briefly to the chest where the scroll had been discovered, and for just an instant a shadow of something darker passed across her features. "Secrets, Mr. Holmes, have a way of becoming burdensome when they are exposed. Perhaps it is time you understood the weight of what you've discovered." Holmes's gaze hardened, his mind already anticipating her next words, his instincts tingling with the sense that something was about to shift dramatically. "You didn't just hide the truth, did you?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with quiet accusation. "You've been actively ensuring that it remained buried for decades, perhaps centuries." Fairfax straightened, the faintest flicker of emotion passing across her face. "The Tower of London has always been a place of power," she said, her voice growing colder, more deliberate. "Some things are meant to remain hidden. This city, this empire, they thrive on the strength of their secrets." Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "What are you talking about? Why would you—" "Enough," Fairfax interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through the air. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, Dr. Watson. The very fabric of this kingdom is built on what is hidden beneath the surface. Uncovering it will unravel everything." Holmes's eyes never left her. He had seen the signs before, the shifting posture, the controlled breathing. She was afraid, and that fear was what would reveal the truth. But fear alone wasn't enough. He needed something more. "You speak of the kingdom," Holmes said slowly. "But what of the betrayal? The society that has used the tower for its own purposes for centuries? What do you know of the Guardians, Lady Fairfax?" Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a tight line. "The Guardians were not meant to be disturbed, Mr. Holmes. Their influence still runs deep, even now." Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And you're still one of them, aren't you?" For the first time, Fairfax faltered. There was a momentary shift in her expression, a flicker of recognition. It was enough for Holmes to see the truth in her eyes. But before he could press further, a sharp click echoed through the room, too loud, too sudden. Both Holmes and Watson whipped around, their instincts kicking in, as a figure stepped from the shadows near the entrance. The man was tall, his face concealed by the hood of a dark cloak. His hands were hidden beneath the folds of the fabric, but his presence was unmistakable. Fairfax's demeanour shifted once more, her calm control crumbling into something far more volatile. "You should not have come," she hissed, her voice low but filled with fury. Holmes tensed, recognising the danger that had just entered the room. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cool but laced with suspicion. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly removed his hood, revealing a face that Holmes immediately recognised, though the recognition hit him like a blow to the chest. It was Dr. Albert Harrington, the archaeologist who had been their key source of information from the very beginning. "Dr. Harrington," Watson exclaimed, stepping back in shock. "But how is it possible? You were supposed to be—" "Dead?" Harrington finished, his voice laced with dark amusement. "Ah, but I am far more useful alive, Dr. Watson, and now it is time for you both to understand the true consequences of your actions." Holmes's eyes hardened, every fibre of his being alert now. There was something fundamentally wrong about this entire situation. Harrington's sudden appearance, his calm demeanour, it all reeked of betrayal, of a plan that had been set in motion long before they arrived at the tower. Fairfax turned sharply to face Harrington, her face contorting with a mix of rage and fear. "This was not part of the agreement," she spat, her voice low and trembling. Harrington smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression. "You never understood, did you, Lady Fairfax? It was never about the secret. It was about the power that secret gives us. And now, Mr. Holmes," he said, his eyes locking with the detective's, "you have outlived your usefulness." The room seemed to tighten, the air growing thicker as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Holmes could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the calm before the storm. He had walked into a trap, but he was not one to be caught unawares. "You've made a grave mistake," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think you have control, but you don't. This game is far from over." As he spoke, Holmes's mind raced. There were too many pieces at play, and the stakes had just been raised. He was not alone in the chamber, and neither was Fairfax. This was a battle of wills, and he would not allow it to end here. But as the man, Harrington, took a step forward, a faint click echoed from behind them, followed by a sudden hiss. Something shifted in the shadows, and before Holmes could react, the world around him exploded into chaos. The room seemed to explode in a blur of motion. A low hiss filled the air, like the sound of 1,000 whispers, as a sharp, acrid stench wafted toward Holmes and Watson. His mind raced, his senses on high alert. The faint click, the subtle shift, and then the sound. The unmistakable sound of something being triggered. Before either Holmes or Watson could react, the chamber was plunged into darkness. The torches along the walls flickered out in unison, leaving them in a suffocating blackness, the oppressive air now thick with the scent of oil and something far more dangerous. Holmes's hand shot to his pocket, his fingers closing around the matchbox. But before he could light a match, a shrill sound pierced the air, sharp, mechanical, and unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of a trap being set in motion. "Stay close," Holmes muttered, his voice calm despite the chaos. His mind was already working through the possibilities. The chamber had been designed to conceal something, and now it was working against them. The hiss of the trap grew louder, the sound of a mechanism winding into place, and Holmes's mind raced, trying to find the key to stop it. Watson, ever faithful, was already at his side, his own hand gripping a revolver, though the lack of light made it impossible to see anything clearly. "Holmes?" Watson said, his voice tense. "What is it? What's happening?" Holmes's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. "I don't know yet, Watson, but we need to find a way out of here. Fast." The sound of their breaths, shallow and quick in the darkness, was the only thing that remained. Holmes's mind worked like a machine, turning over every possibility, every detail of the chamber. The walls, the chest, the inscriptions, the trap, whatever it was, had been set to prevent anyone from reaching the heart of this mystery. But it was more than that. It was designed to protect something far more dangerous. "Hold on," Holmes muttered, his voice gaining strength. "I believe I can disable it, but we must act quickly." He fumbled in his coat, pulling out a small tool that was as familiar to him as the back of his hand. In the darkness, his fingers moved with precise determination, his years of training guiding him through the process. The hissing sound was growing louder now, closer, as though the very air was constricting around them. "Holmes, please." Watson's voice was tight with fear, his words quickening. "What are you doing? We need to—" "Trust me, Watson." Holmes cut in sharply, his voice firm. "We're not going to let this defeat us." A moment later, the sound of the trap faltered, the mechanical hiss sputtering to a stop. Holmes exhaled in relief, but his eyes remained sharp, every muscle in his body coiled, ready for whatever came next. The darkness was oppressive, but it was no match for the clarity of his mind. The trap had been disarmed, but the danger was far from over. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to lift. The faint light of a torch flickered back to life on the far wall, casting long shadows across the chamber. Holmes's heart still raced, but he didn't allow himself to relax. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the space for any further threats. Watson, equally alert, was beside him, his grip still tight on the revolver. "You did it," Watson said, his voice a mix of awe and relief. "How did you—" "Deduction," Holmes replied, his voice as calm as ever. "Every puzzle has its key, Watson, and this one had a simple one. It was a pressure mechanism. Once I understood the trigger, it was just a matter of releasing the tension." Holmes turned, his gaze falling once more on Lady Fairfax, who stood frozen, her face pale in the torchlight. Her expression was one of both surprise and fury, as though she hadn't expected this turn of events. "You!" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? You think you can simply waltz in here and expose everything? There are forces far beyond your comprehension at play here." Holmes met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I have exposed nothing yet, Lady Fairfax. The truth is still to be told." Before she could respond, a faint sound broke the tension. Footsteps, hurried and unmistakable. Holmes and Watson both turned toward the entrance, where Dr. Harrington, his face drawn and pale, appeared in the doorway. His eyes darted from Holmes to the still-seated Fairfax, his face a study of fear and desperation. "You—" he began, his voice weak. "You've ruined everything, Holmes. You've exposed the truth. Now, it's too late." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his lips curling slightly. "The truth, Dr. Harrington. Which truth do you speak of?" Harrington's face twisted with frustration, and his hands clenched at his sides. "The truth that was never meant to be revealed. The truth about what lies beneath this tower. It's not just history, Holmes. It's power. Power that can change everything." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Harrington. "Power is an illusion. It is control that you crave, not truth. And in the end, it will be your undoing." There was a moment of silence, one filled with the heavy weight of everything that had come before. Watson's breath was still quick in the aftermath of the trap, but he was watching both men with suspicion. "Holmes?" Watson said, his voice steady now. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze never wavered as he turned back to face Fairfax. "The Guardians, the society tied to this place, they were never about protecting a secret. They were about protecting the tower itself, and the legacy of power that it holds. This scroll," he said, holding up the ancient document with careful precision, "was the key to keeping the truth hidden." Fairfax's lips curled into a smile, though it was one filled with bitterness. "And you think you can stop it, Holmes? You think you can change centuries of history?" Holmes's eyes flicked to Harrington, who had begun to move toward the exit, a look of desperation now painted across his face. "I don't need to change history, Lady Fairfax. I need to ensure that it isn't rewritten with blood. The truth is not a weapon. It is a guide, and it is something you, and those like you, will never understand." As Holmes stepped forward, his mind already piecing together the final moments of this long-fought battle. He could feel the weight of their actions. The pieces had fallen into place. Lady Fairfax, Dr. Harrington, both had been complicit in keeping the tower's darkest secrets. But the truth had been revealed, and now there was no turning back. The chamber, once filled with shadows, was now alive with the light of revelation. And Holmes knew that the shadows, though momentarily banished, would always linger, waiting for their next opportunity to rise again.